The third and final proof strategy that I want to suggest to you simply is to apply indirect proof. So often it may be hard to choose a strategy. And I would always suggest to first try out backward planning, because backward planning is goal-oriented. When you use backward planning, you are sure that you are moving towards the conclusion that you want to establish. And only if backward planning does not work, meaning only if you are unable to make progress using backward planning, only in that case I would suggest to try forward planning. Forward planning has the big disadvantage that you are not sure whether you are in fact making progress. If you apply forward planning, you may be adding lines to your proof, but these additional lines may not actually help you to get any closer to the conclusion that you want to go to. And then if forward planning does not work, try indirect proof. Indirect proof is a little bit like the sledgehammer for logicians. Indirect proof works in those cases where all else has failed. So setting up indirect proof is pretty straightforward. We have already discussed this. Suppose you want to establish A. And you have tried backward planning. Backward planning doesn't help you to prove A. You have tried forward planning. Forward planning does not help you to prove A. Well, in that case, start a subproof that begins with the supposition that not A, and try to derive a contradiction. And if you are able to do that, then you can infer A and cite indirect proof. Now I'll add some question marks here to remind myself that I have not actually established A yet. So I still need to fill in some blanks before I can conclude that A. This proof illustrates the use of indirect proof as a proof strategy. Here I want to prove A or not A from no premises whatsoever. Now, backward planning doesn't help. Backward planning would tell me I should prove one of the two disjuncts, A or not A, and then use disjunction introduction to infer my conclusion. But it's clear that I'll not be able to prove A or not A from no premises whatsoever. So backward planning doesn't help me. Forward planning also doesn't help, simply because I have no premises to work with. So we need to turn to indirect proof as a last resort. Indirect proof tells me that I should set up a long subproof that starts with the assumption of the negation of what I want to prove. So I will assume that it is not the case that A or not A. And that's an assumption, so I'm drawing a Fitch bar here. And then I'll be able to justify my conclusion by citing indirect proof and the subproof that starts in line 1. Okay. And I want to derive a contradiction, since that's what's needed to be able to apply indirect proof. Now, how can I derive a contradiction? I will try to prove both A and not A to infer the contradiction. So how can I do that? Let's start with the assumption that A, if I assume A, I can infer A or not A using disjunction introduction applied to line 2. But now A or not A contradicts my assumption in line 1, that it's not the case that A or not A. So I can infer bottom and cite bottom introduction as applied to lines 1 and 3. And now I can infer not A using negation introduction applied to lines 2 to 4. Okay, I've established not A based on my assumptions. Next, let's try to prove A, since then I'll be able to justify bottom by means of bottom introduction applied to lines 5 and some other line. How can I prove A? Well, I will again use indirect proof. Assume the negation of A, in this case not A, and try to derive a contradiction. How can I do that? Well, once I've assumed not A, I can infer A or not A, citing a disjunction, introduction, and line 6. And then I can infer bottom, citing bottom introduction applied to lines 1 and 7. And now I can infer A, citing indirect proof applied to the subproof 6 to 8. Now I just need to fill in my blanks, 9, 10, and 11. Line 10 is justified by bottom introduction applied to lines 5 and 9. And line 11 is justified by indirect proof applied to the subproof from line 1 to 10. And that's it. That's my indirect proof of the sentence A or not A.